All right, Alexander. Lavrov, the foreign minister of Russia, made a trip to China to meet his counterpart, Wang Yi. And contrary to what the Biden White House and Brussels was hoping for, which is China to shun Russia and to tell Russia that we're not going to deal with you because of what's going on in Ukraine, and we're also going to jump on the sanctions bandwagon. You had the exact reverse. The statements coming out of China and Russia, but I'll focus on China, is that the relations between China and Russia could not be any stronger. Could not be any
Well, in fact,
stronger. Lavrov talked, well, real quick, Lavrov used the words multipolar, fair and just world, and all of these things as well. So, I mean, you know, this is these two are connected at the hip.
absolutely, and in fact, Wang Yi actually said that they needed to increase their cooperation to an even higher level. That was what he actually said. So I mean, it was, I mean, it was. I mean, first of all, I'm pretty sure that there was an awful lot of practical discussions about all kinds of different things, and I'm going to here express my cynicism. I don't think it's cynicism; it's pure realism. Now, of course, the Chinese say that they weren't informed. The Russians didn't discuss everything that they were going to do. I think it is inconceivable that the Chinese were not fully alerted by the Russians of every single move and step that the Russians were taking over the last year. I mean, I think that is impossible to believe. Bear in mind that there are Chinese military officials in the Russian Defense Ministry and in the Russian Command Center are on a permanent basis. So the Chinese knew all along exactly what the Russians were doing, and in fact we can see further proof of that because in the run up to these events, they've been steadily stocking up. They were stockpiling all kinds of commodities, copper, all kinds of other metals, you name it, they were stockpiling it. So I think the Chinese have known all along what was coming. And I'm sure that the Chinese and the Russians have been working to some kind of agreed plan. And by the way, I think that is partly the reason for some of these diplomatic moves that the Russians have made over the course of the Ukrainian crisis. I think that they were done, at least in part, in order to make China's position simpler. And I think this is almost certainly coordinated with Beijing in advance. So Lavrov goes to Beijing, they compare notes, they're able to do that. They're not using electronic communications, which one must assume are fairly safe, but you never know completely. So they're able to talk face to face without bugs or fears of anybody speaking. They're able to coordinate even further, coordinate even more closely, and Wang Yi goes out of his way to say how China and Russia are exactly as he said, joined at the hip. Team China, Russia. They've game planned and worked this out. And it's astonishing to me that there was anybody in Washington who had any doubts about him.
Right. So this meeting is also going to deal with Afghanistan as well. They're going to be, I believe it's a conference that deals with Afghanistan. Is that correct?
Absolutely. And by the way, the Russians have taken the first step to recognizing the Taliban as the government of Afghanistan. And there's now Afghan diplomats, who are, of course, Taliban diplomats, arriving in Moscow to set up some kind of permanent presence there. Not quite an embassy yet, but it's shaping up to be that. But the Chinese and the Russians working hand in hand to sort out the situation in Afghanistan and doing it together.
Yeah, it's the third ministerial conference of Afghanistan's neighboring countries: Russia, China, Iran, Pakistan, Tajikistan, Turkmenistan, and Uzbekistan. And Lavrov said that the West bears the brunt of the responsibility for the deplorable state of the Afghan economy.
Absolutely. And of course, notice that the Western powers are not invited, or at least they're not present. So sorting out Afghanistan has essentially been taken out of their hands. It's going to be fully absorbed into the Eurasian system with the government that is there now. And
Yeah, not
another
until the
case of the
yeah.
China. Another case of the Chinese and the Russians
Yeah, go ahead.
coordinating. And the Chinese and the Russians coordinating and Iran being drawn ever closer, ever deeper into the system.
Right. So Russia and China are now going to essentially deal with rebuilding Afghanistan, but this happens after the United States, the collective West, raided Afghanistan's central bank. They went after Afghanistan's reserves in central bank, right? A test run
Yeah,
before what they did to Russia.
absolutely. And that's clearly what it was. And of course, they confiscated those reserves. They stole them.
Afghanistan's reserves. Do
Afghanistan's
you know the
reserves, they
amount?
stole them. $7 billion. I mean, compared to what the Russians held, which was $640 billion, I mean, that may seem like a small amount of money, but of course, on any objective basis, it's a huge amount of money, and it's a huge amount of money for Afghanistan.
Yeah, they got it was so Russia, they got half of those reserves, from what I understand, right? It's like 300,
That's
250,
right.
300 billion. So
That's right.
Afghanistan, they took
That's
seven. You said 7 billion.
7 billion. But of course, as you said, it was a trial run for what they were clearly preparing to do.
Right. So now China and Russia and these other neighboring countries are going to step in to fill the void.
Absolutely,
Pakistan and the other
and
neighboring
the
countries.
next and of course this is an Asian tour by Lavrov because next he's heading to India, or so I understand. So he's going to be in India, and apparently the Indians are pressing ahead with the rupee ruble deal, and apparently the transfers are going to be made through the Russian interbank messaging system, the alternative to SWIFT.
Yeah, the Biden White House was sending economic consultants to India as well. I mean, they're panicking. They want India on
Yeah,
side.
yeah. Well, they're not getting India on side. I mean, I think by now, if the Indians were going to change their policy, they'd have done it. They clearly are not going to do it. And the OPEC countries have said that they will continue to adhere to the OPEC plus limits. In other words, they're not going to increase oil production.
Right. This isn't working out for for the Biden White House, is this at all? You know,
No,
Tucker Carlson said something on his show last night. An interesting quote,
yeah.
real quick. He said, "When the dust settles," he had a guest on. I forgot who it was, but he said, "I'm afraid that when the dust settles on all of this with Ukraine and all of this, China's going to be left the ruler of the world." What
I
do you make
wouldn't
of
be.
that statement?
I
So something
wouldn't be.
like that.
I wouldn't be at all surprised. Obviously, at the moment, it's the Russians who are making the big moves. But bear in mind, it's Team China, Russia. China is a much bigger country than Russia economically, population terms, in every conceivable respect. And of course, Russia has now been pulled closer, even closer, into China's orbit. And so everything that's happening, the internationalization of the ruble, which follows from that of the RMB. So what you're going to get is the Russians will be selling their oil and gas to all sorts of people in rubles, except there'll be some countries like Saudi Arabia, which will be trading with China in RMBs. And that's going to be more and more common. So you're getting a completely different financial system created, and bear in mind the ruble anchored to the ruble to gold, but also connected to the RMB. So the Chinese, everything is working out exactly as they wanted. A Europe blasted, relations between China and India improved, Russia linked up to China even more, and the USD losing its dominance to a financial system which will ultimately be dominated by the Chinese. So, I mean, the Biden administration, well, perhaps, they may be working for Chinese intelligence, because it seems to me that everything they're doing is in China's interests.
Okay, so final question. There was a comment made by Lavrov during his visit to China, where he said something along the lines of it's a positive development. Ukraine's statements about in the proposal that they gave during the negotiations in Turkey. their statements and their proposals with regards to Crimea and Donbass. And Lavrov said this is a step in the right direction or a positive direction. Many people were kind of outraged at that. They said, what does Lavrov mean? What is he talking about? How can he see this as a positive development, given the fact that Ukraine said, they're never going to recognize the Donbass, and with Crimea, they put all kinds of conditions with the recognition of Crimea. What do you think Lavrov was?
Yeah,
was hinting at, or what he was talking about with those statements?
I mean, bear in mind, he said that in Beijing. So again, this is all about helping the Chinese, because the Chinese position is that they want to see negotiations between between Russia and Ukraine. So I think this is basically, again, providing political cover for the Chinese so that the Chinese can go on backing Russia, because the Chinese can say, well, the Russians are engaging in these negotiations with Ukraine, and we should all back those negotiations and not sanction the Russians or go down the route of aggravating the war. But as for what actually happened in Istanbul, I did a long program, 40-minute program on my channel, in which basically I took it apart. And it is a fact that the Ukrainians have made some faltering steps towards meeting Russian conditions. They've accepted that they're not going to join NATO, that they're not going to participate in any blocs. They've given the Russians, there's no essential about it, they've given the Russians veto power over the stationing of foreign troops in Ukraine, over the setting up of foreign bases in Ukraine, over the, joint exercises with foreign forces in Ukraine. And for the first time, the Ukrainians have said that they're prepared to discuss the topic of the future status of Donbass, and they've also sort of said the same about Crimea up to now. Now, they've not done any of these things in ways that the Russians would remotely call acceptable. And we had a whole string of statements yesterday from Russian officials, made, by the way, after I made my video. But if you follow them, from Peskov, from Medinsky, the chief negotiator, from some of the military people, basically they were saying essentially the same points, that these are not remotely acceptable. I mean, Crimea isn't even a topic for discussion as far as the Russians are concerned. So all of these points that the Russians were saying yesterday about this is unacceptable, these things that the Ukrainians are coming up with are unacceptable, but at least they've taken, a half step towards our demands. I think that is the real Russian position. It's the Russian position expressed in Moscow. But when Lavrov is in Beijing, he wants to spin it a little, make it sound a little better. He says, well, at last the Ukrainians are putting forward a written document in which they're saying they're not going to join NATO or be aligned in blocs, and they're talking about Donbass and Crimea, which they've never done before. So he gives a slightly more positive feel to it, because that's what the Chinese want, so that when Blinken telephones Wang Yi, Wang Yi is able to say, well, we haven't changed our long-standing principles. We always seek peace. We always support negotiations. Negotiations are happening between the Russians and the Ukrainians. We need to support these negotiations. What you're trying to get us to do is not going to support those negotiations. It's going to inflame tensions, aggravate the situation even further, and therefore we're not doing it. So it gives, what Lavrov was saying, gives the Chinese political cover and political space, and it shouldn't be seen as anything more than that.
Right. Okay. Real quick, kind of off topic, maybe connected to a certain extent. What do you make of South Ossetia and their claim that they want to enter the Russian Federation?
I think it's going to happen. I think it's only a question of time. I think this has been the agenda all along, and I think they will. Why not? Again, it doesn't make any logical sense. And note that they're doing that at the moment when relations between Ukraine and Georgia are at breakdown. Ukraine is recalling its ambassador from Georgia because Georgia is refusing to support Ukraine over this crisis, because, of course, the Georgians know perfectly well that they're going to face terrifying consequences if they were to take a different approach. So Georgia is being pushed back into Russia's orbit. And given that that is so, the South Ossetians, who've always basically wanted reunification with Russia, because they want to be together with their compatriots in northern Ossetia. It's one nation. So the Ossetians want to reunite with Russia. They sense that Georgia is softening, so they're making a bid. I don't think it's going to happen immediately, but give it a year, give it 2 years, I'm sure it will happen.
All right. We will leave it there. theduran.locals.com. If you're watching from Rumble, then you will see a button up top. If you're watching on a web browser from Rumble, you'll see a button up top, a red maroon button, which will take you directly to our Locals community. Click that button and join us on Locals as well. We'd love to have you join the Locals community. And the Duran shop. Use the code GOODDAY. 10% off all merchandise when you use that code. There's the mug. And the code is GOODDAY. Take care.